Today we're going to replace the headset flex cable, which also controls the volume and the buzzer on an iPhone 4S. So on this particular one, there's a problem with the headset jack, can't hear out of it, and this is the part that we are going to replace. It's also got the microphone for the speaker phone built in line with it, so you'll be replacing that as well as the volume controls all at once. Just to change one, you have to change them all. You can kind of see how the layout works here, and we're going to start by removing the back panel. So you'll need a pentalobe driver, most likely. In fact, definitely if you've got a 4S, you'll need a pentalobe. Go ahead and remove your SIM card tray as well. We will be pulling the board out. It's the only way that you can access this cable. And then the two screws adjacent to the charging port will be removed. And now you can just kind of slide this upward on the back. It's a little bit tricky, and sometimes these things stick, so you might have to push up. Just kind of grip it with your hand and push straight up there. But once it moves all the way up, you can kind of pull that off the back. They have little sliding hooks that go into the bezel. And the first thing we want to do is disconnect the battery. So you'll have two screws that are holding this little retaining plate where the battery terminal connects. And if you can see just next to that, there's a little black piece that actually goes underneath the metal piece. And I recommend you get a pair of tweezers or something to kind of maneuver that out. Don't want to lose that piece. What we do is we pry this straight up away from the phone very carefully. If you go in there too deep, you can damage the place where the port plugs in. And here's a little black piece that I'm talking about. You will need to keep that, so we can put that in later on. That holds the antenna wire in place and also grounds on the rear panel of the phone. So once you pop that up, you're going to have some adhesive under the battery. As usual, you can kind of ignore that little plastic tab on the left. That's generally not going to help you remove the battery. And most of the time, they will tear if you pull them off. And the exception would be if the phone's been opened before or it's got some liquid inside of it that's worn out the adhesive. Otherwise, if you pry just in this area right here, you can usually get, with a blunt object, don't use anything sharp, you should be able to get under the battery and then pry it out. And this is the cable here that you have to be very careful of when you're working on this phone. I like to just kind of fold that little plastic piece over onto the adhesive. And then what we'll do is go ahead and remove the screws from the Emi Shield, the ones that hold the main flex cable in place, and a couple other screws that basically just hold the board onto the mid frame. And you can see a little panel came out from behind the charging port flex cable, which we will also pry out. This is another pop connector, and it will have some adhesive under it generally, so you want to be very careful when you peel that back, and then it just kind of opens up at the bottom here. If you have to apply some heat, that will make it a little bit easier to peel that off, but you don't want to tear it. Next thing we're going to do is disconnect the antenna wire down here from the bottom, and you can see that kind of routes around a little clip, and then there's a screw at the bottom, so make sure you put those back in the same way that they come off. This time we don't have to remove the charging port. On the 4S, fortunately, you can pull the board out without having to move the charging port out of the way, and that is not the case with the iPhone 4, so one thing got a little simpler with this one. And this does happen to be a CDMA version of the 4S, so most of the parts are compatible. There are some exceptions, but for all practical purposes, the procedure for replacing this part should pretty much be the same. And if you have a magnetizer, that will make it a lot easier to get these screws out. They like to kind of stick down in there until you pull on them. And once you've got all the screws released from the Emi Shield, you can kind of carefully go behind it here and just pry it down a little bit. Be very careful about those flex cables in that area. You don't want to scratch them, but that little clip on the bottom will release the panel. And we've got another screw here that we're going to take out, and this is also part of the antenna system at the top. So you kind of get underneath this, and it's a little difficult to explain how this works, but once you get it out, you can kind of see the way it sits down inside. And from here, what we want to do is release the antenna cable and all of our flex cables. I recommend you do this before you take out too many screws. You don't want the board to be coming out and only being held in by the flex cables. That's what tends to create stress on them, and you definitely want to avoid that. That's the camera we're taking out, and then we have, again, I've just folded over one of these flex cables, the one we're replacing, to keep it out of the way. And then these other two we're going to disconnect and just carefully work around them. You'll have your LCD and digitizer pop connectors up here at the top. Just kind of bend those up towards the top. And there's the one hidden screw up here at the top left-hand corner of the board. If you do not remove this little piece of plastic, you never know it's there, and you can definitely damage the logic board if you pry against that. So make sure that you do remove this hidden screw, and you'll see I'm exposing it now when we pull the tape off. And there's a little gold piece that sits right underneath the screw, so also take note of the position that that's in, because we'll be replacing that in order to make contact with the camera at the top of the phone also. And now we've got these threaded barrel screws that are kind of goofy. They're not really a Phillips and they're not a standard, but usually if you take a slotted driver, you can get inside there enough to turn it, and then a lot of times you'll transition over to a small Phillips, which you can see is probably just going to spin around here at this point. So the slotted one you'll need to use to break the screw away when it's tightened down all the way. And when you're putting it back in, you'll use it at the last step to put it to make your final turns. But initially, threading those screws in is best done with a small Phillips magnetizable driver. And we've got a couple more screws, one in the middle of the board and one over at the bottom left-hand side, where just above the vibrator. So those will come out. And again, assuming you've removed the SIM card already, you should be able to free the board now. Just kind of lift it up from the bottom, and it is wedged in under the edge of the mid-frame at the top of the phone. And if you take note, there's a little rubber gasket there. You want to make sure that stays on the logic board. That'll keep it from chewing through the flex cables at the top. And if you wanted to remove the charging port at the bottom, there are only 2 screws remaining down there at this point, but we don't need to remove them for this particular repair. What we are going to do is try to release this and very carefully work around the components on the inside of the phone. This is where it gets kind of iffy. You've got to be really careful. We've got a lot of things that can be damaged, several screws that will need to be removed, and some hardware as well. It's going to transfer over to the new flex cable. So while the part's relatively inexpensive, there is a pretty significant amount of labor involved in performing this repair. And you can see I went after that one with the tweezers. A little bit tricky to get it out sometimes. And we've got this whole little metal bracket here that is attached to, gosh, I don't even know how to describe it. It's kind of like half plastic and half adhesive that goes over the top of the headset jack. And you'll see here shortly, I'm going to heat it up and go ahead and peel that away. And there are a couple different pieces actually. Sometimes they both come off at once, and sometimes you'll only take the upper piece off. So let me not get ahead of myself here too much. We're going to go under this with the pry tool and just separate it from the headset jack itself. And you see I've got the entire plastic piece with the adhesive, so we can just kind of take that all off at once, set it aside. The less stuff that we take apart, the better. It's going to make our job easier when it goes to back to the reassembly procedure. And you can see up here at the top, if you are replacing this cable, you don't have to worry too much about damaging it. But if you're not, if you're trying to salvage it, it's very easy to damage the top microphone because it's got an adhesive pad right above it that kind of locks it and holds it in place at the top of the frame. So you've really got to carefully get inside here and peel that away before you try to take the headset jack out. If you don't, you will tear that cable. It's really, really super easy to damage this thing. So the headset jack itself actually kind of slides down and comes out from the bottom. It's a little bit hard to describe here, and because I've still got some residual adhesive on this cable, it makes it a little tricky to maneuver that. So again, I'm going to go, even though this is going to be replaced, I like to just kind of try to preserve it as much as possible. If nothing else, for the sake of practice, this is a good idea. See if you can get that out without ripping it. If you can, you're doing great. So I'm going to go ahead and move over here to the volume controls, because trying to manipulate this thing with the adhesive underneath the flex cables is just really awkward. So we'll go ahead and take the hardware out first. That will give us a little more leeway to work with. And that makes it a little bit easier to get access to the headset jack. And now we can kind of pull that adhesive away from the frame, and the whole thing kind of is exposed at this point. Now there is most likely one more screw that we're going to have to remove here. You can kind of get a look at what this thing is like on the inside. And then we've got this one or two more screws actually here at the top that need to come out in order to release the retaining plate for the silent ringer switch. And this one's got a little bit of adhesive also holding it in place, so I had to kind of go in there with the tweezers as well. And set these screws aside. You are going to need those, of course, when we put it back together. And now we get to the fun part, which is moving this hardware over to the new flex cable. I really think that it would be a great idea for someone to start manufacturing these with the metal pieces already installed. But for the time being, we get to do this ourselves. So you have to kind of take a look at the way these cables are folded as well, because when you buy your replacement part, it's all going to be laid out nice and flat. But of course, we're going to have to bend this stuff around and stick it onto the new hardware. In fact, stick it onto the headset jack that's already attached to it, so that it will situate properly inside of the phone. And sometimes this adhesive that comes with these things works pretty well. Other times you might have to add your own glue. So if it's not really sticking in place properly, the 3M 300, I believe it's 300 SL sheets work pretty well for adding adhesive to flex cables and quite a few other components inside of phones. And you see I took that little piece of rubber adhesive gasket that was on the old microphone, and we're going to transfer that over to the new one. That'll give you a nice seal at the top and prevent any debris from hopefully getting inside of the microphone, because these things are pretty sensitive, especially to moisture. Now we can heat up our volume buttons and remove them from this metal piece. And I recommend you transfer this over to the new flex cable as soon as possible. That will minimize your chances of forgetting where it goes. And of course the adhesive, if there's any left over on there, will generally tend to work in your favor when you install the new piece. But if you leave it laying around, it gets dirty or gets stuck to a tabletop, it kind of loses that adhesive property for the most part. And I'll point out that that is a dulled razor blade, so chances of cutting anything are fairly minimal, as long as you don't apply too much pressure. Now on this clip we have this plastic that Apple likes to use that goes through, as you can see, those two little holes. And what we're going to do is those two pegs here on the new piece are going to go through those same holes, and then we've got to flatten them out somehow. And I'll generally use a soldering iron in order to melt them down so that they're nice and flush, and that will help keep everything in position. But what we have to do first of all is not only pry away the old flex cable, but we've also got to push that plastic through so we have those holes opened up again. So in this situation, you will have to apply a little bit of force because they're held together by more than just glue on the inside. And the trick here is to push through these things without stabbing yourself, so do be careful. You can see I'm kind of limiting the range of motion I have with my tweezers that I'm working with. So once we have that pushed through, we can take our new piece, clean out these holes really well, take the new pegs and push them through. Okay, so I've actually just taken the piece over to the soldering iron and melted down those little pegs so they're nice and flat on this side. And from here we can go ahead and start putting everything back inside. And had it upside down there for a minute. You can see I'm kind of pre-folding this flex cable so that it will be easier to work with as far as going into the correct position. And this is the fun part. It is a little tricky to work around in here. Very small parts. But what you want to do is find something. Generally, I start with this little angled piece. And you want to have your power button in the down position towards the table and the same with the switch itself so that they match up. Otherwise, you're going to have problems. And as soon as you feel that going to the correct position, check on the outside, make sure that it is clicking back and forth. And if it is, I would recommend you put a screw in there as soon as you can, just so you don't have to hold that in place. And it looks like I had that in the wrong position. It wasn't lined up. So we want to have this facing towards the table, and because that's the way that the switch in the phone is going to be. And by the way, if you happen to have had it fall out, the red stripe is going to be towards the front of the phone on that silent buzzer switch. I think it's kind of funny that they call it a silent ringer when generally when someone has their phone on vibrate, you can hear it all the way across the room. In any case, once we've got this piece into the right position, we can go ahead and start putting the screws in. The volume buttons are a little bit easier to install. And then, of course, we've got just that one tricky maneuver in order to get the headset jack in place. But from here out, it's pretty much downhill, as long as you can keep your screws on the end of the driver. And you want to check and make sure that the switch is moving buttons are clicking before you go too far with this. If something's not lined up properly, you'll have to pull it out and realign it. But from here, we've got our adhesive, this little wax paper that we need to take off the bottom. Again, be very careful because now that we've got the new flex cable inside the phone, we do not want to damage it. Otherwise, we have to go through the whole repair again. And remember, we have this little plastic piece that goes on top of the headset jack. We also need the screw that goes through the little, whatever you want to call this metal piece on the side here. I'm sure there's a technical term for it. It's not exactly a nut, or a washer, but kind of similar. And we want to make sure we have this in the right position before we stick it down, because it has a tendency to kind of move out. And over time, that's going to put stress on the cable. So try to get that back as close to the original position as you can. It can be a little tricky. Because as soon as it sticks, it's very, very difficult to move, as you can imagine. And we have this one last piece of wax paper to remove, and then we can go ahead and put the board back inside. Again, make sure that little rubber washer is up at the top. So I just wanted to point out, hopefully you can figure out by reversing the process how to put the board back in. The new flex cable does not come with the little rubber pad, so I'm adding that on here just to prevent it from grounding out accidentally. If you found the video helpful, hit the like button, share it with your friends, subscribe to my channel, and follow me on Twitter or Facebook. Post your questions in the comment section below or visit gocellphonerepair.com/forum. Thanks for watching.